So let me start just as a way of introduction and welcome as more people join our webinar. On behalf of Community Chest and the Southern Africa Food Lab, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this is our second webinar in our series, which we've called Justice, Human Rights and Development. And obviously, we have a particular focus on food systems in terms of development. In our second webinar, the focus here is on the intersection of human and planetary health. And in this, we are focusing very much on the question of nutrition. We're considering the issue of COVID-19, the disruption that has been caused, and how to work now to catalyze a better future. So the series of webinars draws on an online publication which Community Chest and the Food Lab facilitated to coincide with World Hunger Day on the 28th of May. This collection is available on various websites and is also available in terms of, it will be shared in terms of the comment box. And our intention is very much to contribute to making sense on the issue of food in this very difficult time. And the partnership between both these organizations has been very much to draw out key insights into COVID-19 and hunger, and in doing so, to try and explore possibilities in terms of working differently in the future. But it's also an opportunity to document an extraordinary moment in global history. There's this moment of impact, and as things recalibrate or reset, what it is that we are anticipating in the future, and how are we working to set things in motion that would be different. So the immediate impact, I think, as we all know, of this public health crisis has been that this deep fragility of the South African food system and the global food system has been exposed, but in particular the underpinnings of injustice, and to really reiterate that point. So we've gone through this period of deep uncertainty and change, and with that, an opportunity for recalibration. So this could be a resetting of something that's either based on the same powerful actors and networks of the old dominant system, or possibly something new and emergent. And it's these tensions and questions that we'd really like to explore. In this particular webinar, we'd like to focus on the issue of nutrition as being central to human and economic development. The predicted impact of COVID-19 had emphasized the weakness in policies, programs, stakeholder accountability, governance in relieving malnutrition. In particular, poor diets continue to be a leading cause of life years lost, of diets of infants and young children remaining suboptimal. We have issues around adult overweight and obesity, which are on the rise. Indeed, almost 70% of packaged foods are not aligned with healthy diet recommendations. Fruit, vegetables, their intake remain low. These are just some of the dimensions in terms of questions of nutrition and COVID. In terms of responding and commenting on this intersection of human and planetary health through the lens of nutrition, we have three speakers on our panel. So what I'll do is briefly introduce the speaker and pose an opening question to each. And in such a way, we will run through the panel with a particular emphasis on whether and how COVID-19 can be used to catalyze a better future. Whilst each of the speakers presenting, I'd like to invite you to respond and pose questions using the comments and the question and answer function. And we will then synthesize, distill those questions and field them to the speakers. Just to note that the session is being recorded, so we intend to also produce a video that can then be disseminated much more. After the question and answer session, we have an opportunity for my colleague, Zaharia Barnes of Community Chest, and indeed the co-facilitator and co-editor of the online collection, to offer a summary and a response to draw out some of the implications. And then we're going to close within an hour. So that's the process as we've outlined it. So my pleasure now to welcome Marcel Mentor, who's a lecturer in the English Education Department of Columbia University in the US. It is very early where you are, Marcel, and just to express our thanks for making yourself available to speak to us. So just in terms of an opening question for you, COVID-19's brought issues of malnutrition to the fore in South Africa. And despite the persistent high rates of nutrition indicators for over 2 decades. So this has been an issue, but yet somehow it hasn't risen to the top of sort of the policy and the political issue. A key issue here is education. My question to you is an elaboration in terms of the relationship between malnutrition and educational performance, so not only for scholars, but students, for adults, and what this has to do in reinforcing intergenerational injustice, which I know is an issue that's very close to your heart.
Right.
I'd like to invite you to share some thoughts on that.
So thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. So the phenomenon of food insecurity, right, often stays with families for generations. So it is an intergenerational curse, right? It is exacerbated by the systematic and unjust social cultural in situations that we find ourselves within South Africa, and more revealingly so in the US, right? Which means that many times a child who experiences food insecurity growing up will also most likely experience it as a first generation or even second generation college or university student, because it stays with us through a period of time, through decades, through generations. And so, having worked on university campuses for the last 15 years, in the US especially, I have seen firsthand what the impact of poverty and financially strapped legacies have had, especially on first generation students. So it's really interesting. It's like when people die, they leave their children a legacy, right? Or they leave them something in the will. And it seems that with poor people, not it seems, but it is that with poor people and people who are financially fragile, this food poverty and insecurity is something that stays with us. And so we see that people face food insecurities for different reasons, right? Like if they are unemployed or they don't make enough money, they have been raised in an environment where poverty is rampant. So children who live in food insecure homes are more likely to become ill or have a harder time recovering, right? Because there's no access to medical care, or go to the hospital more often because they keep staying ill because they don't have the nutrients that feed their body. And this is in addition to the emotional tax of having to worry about how and when the next meal will come, especially when children are perceptive enough to know that the stresses of being fed is really hard for their caregivers to bear. So if they know that mom or dad are struggling to put food on the table, then that becomes not just a physical and biological stressor, but also a social emotional stressor on children. And so food insecurity and hunger can negatively influence a child's school performance from the early years right through 12th grade, right into colleges, right? So research in this field has demonstrated that children from families who are not sure where their next meal will come from are more likely to have lower math scores, or repeat a grade, and are more likely to experience developmental impairments in areas like language or motor skills, and even behavioral issues, and very often behavioral issues as well. So children need these nutrients so that they can grow, develop, focus on learning instead of thinking about the food they need. It's difficult for a child to focus on learning when he or she is experiencing the painful effects of chronic hunger. Um, so according to the study of undernutrition in children, and you can see the link in the publication by the United Nations Children Fund, children who come from food insecure homes are often even shorter in height than average for those of their age, or significantly underweight. But more than that, children may also experience learning disabilities and other cognitive impairments. And so something that's really been unsettling for me more than normal is during COVID, right? We've seen back home how I see people posting pictures on social media. I see how government agencies are working. I see how nonprofit agencies, and particularly the community chest, is working to aid people through feeding, simply because they've lost jobs due to the virus and due to the pandemic. And so it's really interesting for me because we often think of, oh, it's interesting for us. We always see people in lower economic areas struggling. And so we see lots of pictures out of Africa, particularly South Africa, children and people standing in line to be fed. And for me, it's been very, very enlightening and illuminating, really, to be able to see that despite what many want to believe, hunger isn't an issue that only affects what we call third world or developing world countries like South Africa, right? It's a near epidemic right here in the USA, with more than 40% of the households in the United States living below the poverty level. And so it's really interesting that we always look at the US as if it's this glamorous place, this place in the world that is iconic and first world, but more than 40% of its people are in fact living in insecure um, populations of being able to be fed and access to food. What does that then mean for a place such as South Africa, as a country such as South Africa? What does our insecurity and our food access to food show us, right? Um, and so it's no surprise that hunger plagues many families, which of course include children. There's approximately 13 million American children to date who live with or are at high risk of hunger in the US. And chronic hunger, as I said earlier, results in a lack of vitamins and minerals that are necessary for a child to develop these milestones. I remember as a child growing up in Athlone in the Western Cape, um, when it was lunchtime during school classes, we used to bring extra lunch so that we could put it on the little tray that goes around. And so I've come out of a community that feeds um, its population because of the necessity and the lack of access that people have. And so it's interesting to see. I'm 51 years old, and I can remember when I was 5 years old in school. And why are we still struggling with these things 45 years later in my life? And the impact of COVID-19, of course, it's the great illuminator, right? It widens the gap between those who have and those who have not. And so it's really interesting that we work in these forums so that um, we build our capacity for people to be self-driven, for people to be able to have access, for community engagement, to prioritize this. One thing that I think is something really great at the university that I'm at the moment, we have these like almost like kitchens across campus where communities, workers can put food in for storage and people can come and take as they leave. And another thing we've seen um, on some of the neighborhoods in New York City is that people are putting up almost like portable fridges, and so people who have access to food and have excess, who have more than what they need, can go and put them down. And so I love these very small but yet incredibly significant spaces where people can actually populate to that. I want to make sure that I answer all the questions or the impacts of the questions that I've been asked. And so, yeah, I think it's really just, it reminds me, it's a stark reminder of this reinforcement of intergenerational injustice, um, racial inequality, racial equity. People are still struggling. If you look at South Africa post-apartheid, the same people who were struggling during apartheid are the same people struggling now post-apartheid. The communities that I'm from, where my father still lives, when I visit, when I'm home, and where I live, when I'm home in South Africa, these are the same people who are still standing in lines for food, waiting to be fed, because there's no other way that they can galvanize themselves into action. And so I think education for ourselves around this is extremely important, but also as we educate our children from kindergarten and preschool all the way through college and into their adult life. Thank you, Scott.
Marcel, thank you. It's very much appreciated, particularly in terms of threading in some of your own perspectives from the US. And it's, again, these little moments of these spaces, even as you refer to them as these small spaces, where issues of solidarity, I think, emerge, which are incredibly important and being a characteristic of this time. And I think your key point in terms of how the injustices of the past are reinforced in terms of what COVID has revealed, it echoes very much what Gareth Haysom was arguing in the previous webinar when he was looking at food poverty and indeed what the nature of that is in here. So thank you for that. Sort of building on this argument, I'm going to call on Lizanne Duplessis, who's an associate professor in community nutrition at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Stellenbosch University. Lizanne wrote a very powerful piece. It was provocative in a very sort of quiet way. Lizanne, you've argued that COVID-19 should be the impetus now for the creation of social safety nets, food supply chains, and urban food environments that are robust enough to support the nutrient requirements of its communities. So it builds very much on what Marcel was saying, you know, these safety nets that we required. The question, why has it taken a global pandemic? Why has it taken that to highlight the silence that has prevailed over the real state of food and nutrition in South Africa over this time? If you could reflect on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, I think there are many different reasons why there's such a silence around nutrition, or why we view nutrition sometimes as a low priority, or why nutrition is perceived as having a weak voice, including in our own country. So I have a few reasons, and I'll share that with you. Some are my own opinion, and the others are all based on literature and so forth. So I just think as a nation, we face very many disasters, and we have very many moments of crisis. So I think we struggle to focus on one topic and to follow through and to do what needs to be done. I think if we just reflect back on last year, with each and every media update and news bulletin, we were updated on the dam levels, the water levels in the country. And that has now been shifted out of focus. Currently, each and every update is on COVID-19. The year before that, it was all on Eskom and power outages. So as soon as the crisis shifts, then our focus also shifts. And what happens is that when these crisis moments come and go, we don't have traction and impetus for a topic such as nutrition. Something else that is a reason for nutrition silence is that sometimes malnutrition is not visible. It's sometimes invisible. And we know that people survive on little food, but people don't thrive on little food. But it's difficult to diagnose or to see if people are thriving. And an example of this is if we take childhood stunting. Now, a child can be short for their age, and Marcel alluded to this, but they may not be sick or may be visibly thin. However, their food and nutrition intake is so low that they are not growing optimally. And of course, their brain growth could also be reduced. So just because malnutrition is not visible doesn't mean it's not there. But that is sometimes why it is not really regarded as a priority. Apart from these facts, the nutrition history tells us that there is a story of power play here, because food is a politicized commodity. And we also know that in many countries, the country is so poor that they cannot afford nutrition programs and nutrition interventions without outside assistance and donor assistance. And some countries have been at war, some countries face natural disasters, and this shifts their focus away from human development. But these reasons still don't complete the picture. In some countries with serious malnutrition problems, such as in South Africa, when governments allocate resources, it is not enough. And if they allocate it is less than what they could and should. Now, this points to weak country commitment to addressing malnutrition. And in turn, this weak commitment leads to low political will or low political demand for actions against malnutrition. And this is a serious issue. We speak about it often, commitment and lack of capacity, and how that eventually impacts on if we can deliver nutrition services. Some other reasons why nutrition has been trapped in this low cycle of low priority cycle includes the fact that dietitians and nutritionists are not given equal standing compared to other healthcare professions and workers, particularly in the medical field. And as a consequence, our opinions in the health system are frequently either undervalued or disregarded. If we look at nutrition in government departments, they are often small and they are generally underfunded, and the funding issue is a big issue, and we also often speak about that. And if you don't have the funds, you are unable to implement programs, and you are unable to implement interventions at scale. Also, nutrition sometimes struggle to find a home in a government department. So some countries will put nutrition under agriculture, and some countries you'll find it in the health department, like in South Africa. In other countries, it may resort under social development. But this trying to find your home often leads to nutrition being shifted under a program. And then we lose visibility, and we also lose the power to be heard. Now, I don't want to project all these issues on and blame and shame other partners, but we also need, as a nutrition fraternity, to look to ourselves and ask, well, how do we communicate nutrition? Are we not clear in our communication? How do we communicate the science? And are our messages about nutrition clear? People often complain to say that nutrition messages are contradictory. So who do you need to believe eventually? I could also argue that maybe we have been ignored. And maybe because nutritionists and dietitians are predominantly female, that may be part of the reason why our voices have not been heard in the past, and that still continues. So if we take all of these reasons together about why nutrition does not receive the priority attention that it does, and we just look at what happened during the COVID-19 when it struck, and also when we went into lockdown. We know that many people were struggling with resources, struggling with money, and they faced acute hunger. And the safety nets in those times were either low or absent, and everyone were fending for themselves to get through this disaster. So what we know about good nutrition and food security is that it enhances peace and stability. We don't exactly know how this works, but this crisis has shown us that poor nutrition and poor food insecurity leads to unrest and instability. And this was very clearly demonstrated when people took to the streets and they started protesting, and some of them in a very violent way. And one person was quoted in the news saying that, "I will rather die of COVID than of hunger." And that was very striking to me. So this acute crisis that happened, this disaster, put the spotlight right onto nutrition and on food. And as we argued, myself and Liesel Engelbrecht, in the piece in the publication, we should not only be speaking about food and nutrition during crisis, but in this case, it was again a disaster. It was a crisis that put the spotlight on a specific topic. And in this time period, it wasn't food and nutrition. So the question that I would pose to myself and to the audience is, how do we keep this spotlight on nutrition and food post-COVID? When this crisis shifts on, how do we actually manage to do that? And we can explore that later on.
Yeah, thank you, Lizanne. That's great. And again, just to draw everyone's attention to these wonderful pieces that exist in the collection, which each of the speakers is elaborating on. So Marcel, I think, very powerfully talked about intergenerational injustice and the underpinnings of that, and the question of food, and particularly nutritious food, and then broader questions of malnutrition in terms of passing this on in terms of intergenerational injustice. And Lizanne has built on that, elaborated in terms of really placing politics and power at the center of this, and raises a question about whose voices are heard. Where are we getting our direction from, and how do we shift that? So I think very, very powerfully entwined the two together. Thank you to those that have begun to raise questions and comments. I see Warren Farah, for example, from the Do More Foundation has raised them. Please do continue to raise questions, and I'll direct them to the speakers as we continue. Kululi Silandela, who's the Senior Manager at Sustainable Agriculture and Smallholder Support Program at WWF South Africa, wrote again a provocative piece with Sipiwe Sitoli, very much focused on Indigenous African foods, voice, who is listened to in terms of setting the agenda around the agricultural nutrition linkage. And I think raising questions that haven't been in the mainstream in terms of a lot of the discussions around food systems and COVID-19. So Mkhululi, you've argued that there's a cultural significance of Indigenous African foods for ecological rehabilitation and social cohesion in this time of disruption. I think that's fascinating. So ecological rehabilitation, thinking about the underpinnings of our systems on ecology, on nature, but then also on collective action, on social cohesion, and drawing those things together. So I'd like you to elaborate on this argument and why you think an increase in lifestyle and indeed non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, which is a risk factor for COVID-19, is linked to our diets. I think this is something that would be really important to explore and understand more. Do you engage with that?
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, everybody. So I think maybe the best way to start at this is to maybe take a step back and look at what has happened before COVID. I think we all know about climate change that is haunting us, and this has come as a result of our food system that has gone astray in terms of the environmental degradation and deforestation. And so it has harmed the planet. And what we've seen now with COVID-19 is that it comes from the zoonosis that is also emanates from us not managing the planet the right way. So it's a clear indication that there cannot be healthy people in an unhealthy planet. So we have to put these linkages together. So it comes, COVID comes at a time when we're already having a public health crisis in South Africa, for example, where we had a fragile food system that was not really responding to the needs, for example, of the poor. But even if you look at the rich, it does not really advise very well as to what is the right thing to do. I think Lizanne was spot on in saying the food is, or the people that are talking about nutrition were not listened to. So there is a lot of policy fragmentation around this. For example, the problem of poor diets and non-communicable diseases like diabetes is a result of that. And came COVID-19. These were one of the most comorbidities that have proven to weaken our immune system. So this is a fundamental problem. And our thinking is that in order to recalibrate the food system, at WWF, we believe that we have to be regenerative. Regenerative in what we do and how we farm, but regenerative in how we do business and everything in our daily life. And there are many solutions that are proposed in terms of how to recalibrate the food system. But one of these is one that is like homegrown and looking at the indigenous foods that we've always had. So this is an area of engagement. Again, the previous colleague, Marcel and Lizanne, have been clear that there's a poor level of engagement until there is a crisis. And now we have another crisis. But if you look, honing into the indigenous foods, you find that they are actually easy to develop and therefore bring an easy plug and play solution to fixing the food system. They are not only inclusive because they are grown in many countries in Africa, they are also nutritious and tasty, and they have health benefits. And if you're talking again about climate change, they actually help us to reduce the climate impact. So they help with our climate resilience because they are resistant to diseases. They don't require a lot of water than the monoculture crops that we damage our health system with. But they address the non-communicable disease problem that we have. And therefore they have a clear advantage on our health budgets if we look from the government perspective. So our food system now is at the crossroads, if you like, still, because our response during COVID was what we could do with the broken food system we had, food parcels that do not look at nutrition. And I think if we were to have COVID-20, we need to start recalibrating our food system now so that we have homegrown solutions that are easy to implement. And my argument was indigenous crops are easy to plant. And if we talk about sustainable development as governments and business, we ought to start at home. We ought to start with things that are easily doable for the person on the street. And indigenous foods have proven to be one solution that could help us to the point where we can increase our resilience to food, to economic shocks and stresses. Thanks.
Nkululi, thank you very much. I think, again, just building very clearly on the narrative that's emerging, what I particularly enjoyed in terms of you moving towards the solutions that are possible in terms of, you almost called it a plug and play, the connecting agriculture, culture back to a question of nutrition, nutritious foods, diet quality, connecting then that back upwards in terms of society, education, generations. I think that's really important. Striking that you mentioned the issue of climate change and indeed the pandemic and food. And it reminds me in terms of that Lancet Commission 2019 argument about a global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, climate change, a year before the pandemic, and COVID-19 adding another crisis into this toxic mix, and just how we need to be really thinking about what it is we're doing in questions of food and nutrition in terms of really engaging and addressing those issues. So thank you. So we're going to move now into a more interactive process. There are a couple of questions that have been posed, and I'm going to just direct them to the speakers and to try and facilitate some discussion. So please, if you are engaged, do write those comments and questions into the chat. Nkululi, you spoke about policy fragmentation. Zahn raised the issue of who gets heard in terms of policy, of voice, of questions of commitment and capacity within the state, for example. Marcel talked about the importance of that in terms of how, without addressing that, this intergenerational injustice is perpetuated. And I see Warren Farrow from the Do More Foundation, he reflects a little bit on this in terms of both the Department of Education and the Department of Health at a very senior level having quite different ideas about the importance of nutrition, and indeed as it should be in terms of the political agenda in South Africa. And his question is, can nutrition education be embedded in our education system, right from ECD through to the higher sort of educational institutions? And if so, what will that take? So that's something very interesting in terms of shifting mindsets, consciousness as a way of drawing that out. So perhaps I could ask each of you just to respond to that, and starting with Lizanne, as I know you've really have engaged with that specifically recently. Lizanne.
Thanks. And thank you, Warren, for raising that question. We also often see that there's no agreement between high-level government officials, not only in government, but other people with voices, if we want to call it that they don't agree on what about nutrition should be shared. And so your suggestion of embedding nutrition and nutrition education into the early years in school, and then also through to the more senior years, of course, we would love to see that. And I have 2 children in school, and I often page through their books to just see what is communicated to the children about nutrition. And I'm happy to say that at least they are communicating more updated nutrition, but I've still found a little piece in the grade 5 or 6 book where they still highlight kwashiorkor as the biggest problem of malnutrition. And I was very surprised and actually disappointed to see that. So I wrote a little piece on stunting for the teacher, and I said to my son, please share this with the teacher so that she can share it with the class, that stunting is our problem that we are facing if we're thinking undernutrition. So, of course, that points to an outdated sharing of information to a group of children who are very influential at that stage. I don't think that any nutrition education is shared in high school. It very much depends on the teacher's interest and what they have been exposed to. So if they are a fan of a fad diet, they would include that into the curriculum. So to answer your question, how do we change this? I think we need to really engage with the Department of Education on a high level, but also starting at school level through to provincial level and up to the national level, where we should be providing them with the information that should be included in the textbooks. And while I'm saying this, I know that we have done this before, and colleagues of mine have done that before, that they've actually contacted these people and offered their services. But I think we should never stop that. We should continue advocating for nutrition from wherever we are and from any position that we hold. We should be staking our claim and sharing the right information, and never stop nagging that we should be heard and that the right information and the latest evidence should be included in all different spaces where we can actually share it. I'm happy also to report that with the rise of nutrition on the global agenda, it has also risen on the national agenda and provincial agenda. So with research that Scott and I have been involved in, we have seen that high-level government officials could explain to us what stunting means, whereas 5 years ago, there would have been no definition and no explanation that would have been given. So slowly but surely, we can see that there is movement and that more and more people are realizing the importance of nutrition and that they are understanding more about nutrition. But there's so much more that should still be done.
Thanks, Lizanne. I appreciate that. Marcel, just in terms of your extraordinary experience as an educationalist, I mean, I think that question also resonates with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree entirely with Lizanne that we shouldn't stop, right? I remember when I was in school, and I keep referring to it, we had health, right? And so we were taught health, and we were taught in science classes how to grow beans and stuff like that. And so I wonder, like, it was so pragmatic way back when, why we don't return to that, and why there's not a more concentrated effort from the powers that be to restructure this curriculum. And it's shocking that they still have kwashiorkor in the in textbooks that children are reading. And it's also saddens me that because it's becoming more of a global phenomenon, our government is now moving. But thank God, whatever makes us move, right? Like Hizan was saying, we can't stop. It's important. It's of vital concern to us as a country, and then also in the broader scale to the world. And so I would, just advocate again for, those of us who have access to curriculum writing, to the knowledge, to be able to push the local authorities, and then, move our way up and up and up, so that it becomes part of our understanding. And I think for those of us who work in nonprofit sectors who do after school programs or workshops or things like that, I'm a big advocate of using and navigating the spaces that we move in to make change. I think change comes from when those of us who are on the ground and in our small ways, and we can blossom and bloom that. And so I'm a big proponent for, yes, do all these things to make sure that we get the legislation around it, that we get the rules, and we get the curriculum changed, but also move in the spaces. Start a little garden, in your front yard, and let the kids from the neighborhood come and grow things. And just, I think we forget that education does not just happen within the four walls of a schoolroom. And those of us who are adults and have access, we are educators in ways that we sometimes forget that we have access to.
Thanks, Marcel. I think that's, again, just it brings it home, your commentary early on in terms of these spaces in which we can operate. And ultimately, it is about the changes that we can evoke, not just relying on the state or the private sector, but actually what we can do in engaging with that. So thank you for that, drawing it home. Just to change tack slightly, Sebastian Gelderblom reflects that, we've heard a lot about sort of whole of government and whole of society responses, but yet, and this is now focusing at not necessarily only on government, but I think largely on government, that there tends to be the silo response. We heard this for a long time. We've had it in policy for 20 years in South Africa in terms of integration around food and nutrition security. This is not new stuff. So his question to us, and I'm going to start, Mkhululi, with you in terms of someone who thinks across silos, is what do you think about integration? How practically can it happen? And what are the barriers are to indeed an integrated, innovative approach? When thinking about integration, sometimes it's a good idea to think about alignment and coordination. Sometimes integration means too much of merging. But how can we work together in synergy in ways that are reinforcing? Your thoughts on that, Mkhululi?
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for that great question. I think it's a wonderful question there. So for me, I think there are many points that could be said about this, but I think where, to me, it starts, if you're looking at the government departments, is, to me, the lack of a common food policy. I think we just recently we were starting to grapple with developing a food policy in South Africa. Whereas if you look at the EU bloc, if you look in the USA, at least they do have a food policy. So when you have a common policy like that, it helps the departments not to see things differently. So the health department must be working to inform the agricultural development as to what are the farmers growing, or what should they be growing? What are they responding to when they are putting their seeds on the ground? So to me, that is how we should be thinking about this in an integrated way. But I think the other element that we could look at here is that the reality is that we live in a capitalist society, and we have to work with the cogs of that machine. And there are very few countries where government is ahead of business, because business is part of the solution. It's also part of the problem. And I think when I started, I said there can be no healthy people in an unhealthy planet, but I think also there can be no business cannot succeed in a society that is failing. And the society is failing now, primarily because the food system is not allowing our kids to develop through their full potential if they are stunted. You cannot compare them to countries that are really managing the nutrition aspect part of it. So in terms of our competitiveness globally, those kids, when they run the country, they will not be competitive as the other countries that manage the nutrition aspects of their kids well. So what I'm saying, the other cog in this machine is making sure that business does not only run with a profit-only motive. They can run with a motive that says nutrition is one of the answers to many problems, and that could tie back to saying, how do we integrate the policies? How do we have a common food policy that looks after the economy, the society, and business? Yeah.
Thank you, Mkhululi. And I, again, just to appreciate you connecting it in terms of changing mindsets and making the point that although we often say this is a societal problem, quite practically you said, actually this has a real implication for growth, for building livelihoods, for the state and the private sector to ultimately be able to exist and perpetuate. So again, just taking theory into practice. And this question, I think, was beautifully reiterated by Anne-Marie Muller, who is somebody who I know thinks a great deal, works with academics and researchers, but very, very much in an activist way, translates that into real programs, and also raises the question about how the challenges of multi-sectoral approaches are perhaps more commonly dealt with in terms of theory and less in practice. And clearly what you were saying is that we've got to find a common purpose, something like an incentive to draw people to be able to see how to work in a more aligned, coordinated way. Arthur Ramaroka, you raise a very important question about indigenous foods within the South African context, and that we don't fully understand them or indeed integrate, synthesize them into our systems and their potential. You sort of raise that in a very important way, connecting again to the issue of climate syndemics. And this was something Mkhululi was talking about. I would be interested to hear from Lizanne in terms of your sense of questions around indigenous African foods, climate and nutrition in terms of the solutions as we're working towards upending the food system to create something that is stronger, more resilient, and ultimately better for everyone.
Thanks, Scott. And I'm just keeping an eye on some of the comments and questions coming through related to that. I think Anne-Marie touched on it again. Warren now in his comment said that if we want different systems and different departments to work together, we can't just rely on one sector to make that work. Government isn't responsible for everything, although they have a huge mandate that they should fulfill, and we should keep them accountable to that. But other sectors, like the private sector, civil society organizations, have added their voices to the debate. And also the dialogues that we've been having with Community Chest and the publication, and also with food dialogues, I think that has brought to the front that the time for talking and doing this as an excuse me, academic exercise is over. We can't just be talking about it, we should be doing this. And just as an example, after being exposed to more of the systems issues and more multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral working together to get all of these different aspects on the table and talked about and integrated, I started teaching my students about multi-sectoral work and stakeholder analysis and all of that, so that they understand it from an early stage. So once they enter the job market, that is already solidified, that they understand what working together means. And if we look at the history of nutrition, we so often slip back into that silo approach because it's a comfortable place to be. But we all know, and through history, as it has been reiterated, that we need to work together. Multi-sectoral work is the way to go. But although we know it's the best solution, we also know it's the very hardest way of working. Just an example is the high government officials not understanding the importance of nutrition, and not speaking the same language. So if we're not speaking the same language, how are we going to break down the silos, and how are we going to understand how to bring all of these things together? So most definitely multisectoral work, communication about that, good communication, learning all of these different skills, but getting different people into the nutrition space. Some people are scared to do that, and they're going to lose their foothold if you just let in everybody and anybody in. I have a different take on that. I believe that we are going to strengthen nutrition if we let more people into, if I can call it our space, like claimed by dietitians and nutritionists. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be opening it up, holding each other accountable to good science, and then say, okay, how are we going to redefine the language around nutrition, food systems, climate, and this multisectoral working together?
Okay, thanks very much, Lizanne. It strikes me, just in terms of some of the commentary that we're hearing from the Do More Foundation, by extension DG Murray Trust Memory, but also WWF, that there are examples of these organizations, whether it's private sector initiated or it's finding new types of partnerships, that it is possible to bring different stakeholders together to then address what is indeed a wicked problem. So just to acknowledge and recognize that. So last question, I just want to direct towards Marcel. There was a very interesting argument about pulling to a question, and this comes from Stian Vandrach, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, and if by bringing these together, we could in fact ultimately address some of these challenges. He places the word gender in the middle of that. Without gender equality, with equity, gender equity, we will not resolve this. Just to get a response from you to that point.
Right, I agreed, Stian. When you asked your question, I opened up a tab and looked at the SDGs again, and I was like, yep, you're right. I mean, I think all of these things run parallel, right? We all have to be working on all of them at the same time. In some of us in different little groupings, and some of us in smaller capacities and in spaces that we have expertise in. But I think that's right? I think when we talk about racial equity, we also have to talk about gender equity. And so, like, for us who live in the US, we have this whole Black Lives Matter movement that has also spilled over into other countries and to other protests. But then we start thinking about, what does it mean then when a trans person who is not, valued, whose life is not valued as much as somebody who is cisgendered or who would be considered straight. And so it's like, yes, everybody's life matters. And so also gender equity is really, really important. And I think for those of us on the continent, that's still a hard struggle sometimes, because in Africa there are still these cultural norms that consider people to be strange or weird when their sexual orientation is not what we consider to be within this framework that makes us acceptable. And so I totally agree that all of them, if you Google SDGs, and this is just for everybody, it'll give you a very nice website where there all 17 of them are on there, and they're highlighted, and you can click each one, and then it opens up. And I agree, we need to break down these walls and barriers and work together to address this. And like Lizanne said, there is room for everybody at the table. Everybody comes with some form of expertise, right, from where they come in. So it's like, we have to listen. We have to be able to say, oh, you know about that? I don't know about that. And so for me, it's like, I always tell people, when people say to me, I would say, if I don't know anything, then I'm going to ask. If I don't know about something, I'm going to ask. And then don't ask me, you don't know that, and be mocking and derisive. No, I don't. That's how I learn, right? And so we have to create for ourselves these spaces that we ask people. We ask the older folk in the communities, how did you guys do this before? What is this for? What do we use this for? Because we live in a country that in fact is nutrient rich. And so we can grow these things. And so it's crazy. That's why Europe took over most of Africa, because we have all the resources. And so we need to stop drinking the Kool-Aid where we think we can't help ourselves. The Americans say, don't drink the Kool-Aid, right? Don't drink the Kool-Aid. We can help ourselves. We know these things. We have people who have expertise. I attended the Fulbright African Summit in Boston last year, and there are researchers from the continent who are just the most brilliant minds. And so when people say, oh, Africa is backward or whatever, I'm just like, man, be quiet. You don't even know what you're talking about. We have all the resources that we need. And I think our struggle is that we are divided sometimes by the leadership and stuff. And so we have to keep opening ourselves to these spaces where we invite people in. And Lizanne, I'm 500% behind you in the, yes, everybody come. It's not an exclusive club. Everybody's welcome, should be welcome.
Thanks, Marcel. And I think you've also posed the question for our last. I'm going to ask Lara to sort of summarize a little bit and draw out implications from what we've heard. But as when she's finished, to pose a question to each of the panelists, very, very briefly, literally in a hand. Now, what would your advice be to everyone participating in this in terms of what we can do in terms of this question around nutrition, COVID, justice? Before that scenario, I would be delighted to hear from you in terms of your reflections broadly on this conversation that's unfolded.
Thank
I could
you,
invite
Scott.
you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to all the speakers. I think what is clear is that COVID-19 has been a time of crisis and disruption, as has been emphasized by all the speakers in this particular webinar and in many webinars, discussion forums that have been happening during this period. And while it is a crisis, it also provides a moment for where systems are weakened and where voices such as the ones on this particular webinar can come to the fore, where issues which have been marginalized previously can suddenly have a platform which is amplified. And so just to look at the specific pullouts from the various speakers, it's very difficult to obviously do it comprehensively in the time allowed. But I think Marcel brings a kind of universal approach. If by universal I can look at South Africa and the US as examples of that approach. And she says that 40% of households live below the poverty line in the US, and 13 million children in the US are nutritionally deprived. And that's quite a stark statistic when one looks at that. And she speaks of the intergenerational justice, which in fact gets perpetuated through generations. It's not specific to the US, it's in South Africa as well. And I think we can identify very much with the issue of intergenerational justice, injustice, and deprivation. Lizanne, posed the question, how do we keep the focus on nutrition after this crisis has passed? And she speaks about stunting, and I think that is quite illuminating when she speaks about the invisibility of stunting. And it's not the kwashiorkor that one is familiar with in the textbooks, but things that are not as visible. And what that means in relation to healthy individuals and in fact a healthy society, and the link between that and developmental elements or development within the society. Nkululi speaks about the link between human and planetary health. He drew that very clearly, where he speaks about how environmental degradation, deforestation is clearly linked to the origins of a pandemic such as COVID-19. And his phrase, healthy people cannot exist in an unhealthy planet, and calls for the recalibration of food systems and in fact a focus on indigenous crops and foods. We should turn to indigenous crops and foods in order to address some of these issues. Some of the general issues is that all the panelists have agreed it's a systemic issue that we are dealing with, cannot be dealt with piecemeal. There has to be an integrated, multi-sectoral approach which isn't siloed, one which is inclusive and not which excludes voices, has to be collaborative. And you know, Mkhululi says food systems are now at a crossroads. So now that we are at this crossroads and we have this opportunity in this pandemic, how do we move in an integrated, systemic, multi-sectoral approach and keep the issue on the agenda? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zanaria. I think that was very crisp, beautifully synthesized. So just in closing, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity just for a very brief final reflection in terms of any thoughts you have about what we can do in terms of this issue, going beyond in terms of just discussions and dialogues and webinars, but into active life. Lizanne, may I start with you?
Thanks, Scott. I think we have a huge opportunity here. Food and nutrition and food security and insecurity is on everybody's lips. So we need to cash in on this moment. And while everybody is so much aware of food and nutrition and the importance of it in human health and human development, we should each try to keep this flame burning for nutrition. So I would like to plead to everyone out there that take our hands and speak about nutrition wherever you can. Speak about the importance and keep government accountable, keep academia accountable, keep industry accountable, and keep every citizen of this country accountable to work together to speak about nutrition in a positive way and keep nutrition on all of the agendas so that we can get better traction from this whole discussion and this crisis.
Thanks, Lizanne. Marcel, may I ask you?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm an educator. I'm always going to say education is the key, and I do not reserve education for the walls of the classroom. And so I think it's really important that those of us who have access to spaces and access to people, whether they're in community, whether in government, whether in legislation, use the spaces that you can to educate people and to move people, keep the impetus alive, as Lizanne says. I remember as a 10th grader, I was in 10th grade in 1985, part of the struggle during apartheid. And people used to say, is it liberation before education or is it education before liberation? And the answer to that is it is education for liberation. And so I think for us, if we have to set ourselves free, to liberate ourselves from the scourge of hunger and food poverty and intergenerational, racial and gender-based inequity, it comes from that. I think Mkhululi asked such an interesting question. When people say, what is the scourge in South Africa? They say crime. And he says that, does crime not come from hunger? And I think that is a striking question. And so we have to move in all the spaces that we can to educate people to do better, to do more. And thank you so much for all of you who are here and coming to talk. And I know that we have people in some really interesting places in the country that are working on a day-to-day basis. Keep working, keep pushing, keep educating. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Thank you. Mkhululi, a word from yourself.
Thanks, Scott. So I think for me, there's two ways to look at this. I mean, hunger happens in the urban and in the rural context. And I think for me, I've spoken about the role of the indigenous foods, and having traveled in many and worked in many African countries, I was happily satiated by these crops in whichever country I was. But I think if you're looking at practical solutions, I would say, especially in the urban environment, and I saw Gareth Heiselman was here, people want to grow gardens, food in the gardens, and I think we should be talking to the local government to take away the constraints of growing food in the home gardens, like water rebates for food growing, for example. But the other bigger context is going back to the old strategies of community mobilization. Each one teach one about nutrition. What should you be eating if you want your family to thrive in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Mkhululi, and indeed, thank you everyone for this. I think that phrase, education for liberation, is so striking, nutrition for liberation, and to thank you all for your participation, and to put it out there that we will host another one of these soon. And the idea of bringing together speakers that aren't necessarily normally on the same platform, but to really generate new ideas in terms of discussions that are set up like this is something that Community Chest and Food Lab would plan to continue. So to thank you all very much and wishing you a very good day further. We'll see you all soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.